Imagine a military so powerful that its leaders boasted they could bomb their enemies back into the Stone Age. That is not a figure of speech. It was the actual mindset of American commanders during the Vietnam War. They believed that with overwhelming firepower, constant aerial bombardment, and sweeping ground missions, they could break the will of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army. But instead of winning, this approach backfired spectacularly. The strategy that was supposed to guarantee victory ended up fueling the very resistance it was meant to crush. The American military entered Vietnam with a doctrine built on total war. Total war is not just fighting enemy soldiers, it is fighting the enemy's land, their homes, their crops, and even the civilians who might support them. The idea is to strip away every resource, every safe haven, until the enemy has no choice but to surrender. In World War II, this type of strategy had been devastatingly effective. Firebombing cities like Dresden and Tokyo, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these tactics had forced enemies to collapse under the weight of destruction. Many American generals carried those lessons forward into Vietnam, convinced the same overwhelming force would work again. But Vietnam was not Germany or Japan. The geography, the culture, and the political dynamics were completely different. The enemy was not a conventional army lining up on open battlefields. It was a guerrilla force that hid in jungles, blended with villagers, and relied on the support of the very population that America's total war tactics were alienating. Yet, American commanders pressed forward with the same mindset. They believed the key to winning was not holding territory, but body counts. Every mission, every raid, every bombing run was judged by how many enemy soldiers were killed. The higher the number, the closer they believed they were to victory. This obsession with body counts led to the infamous search and destroy missions. American troops would move into villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong, sweep through houses, and torch anything that looked like it might provide cover or supplies. Sometimes entire villages were destroyed in these operations. The logic was simple: deny the Viet Cong any sanctuary. But the effect was disastrous. Instead of weakening support for the Viet Cong, it pushed more civilians toward them. Imagine watching your home burned, your crops ruined, and your family displaced by foreign soldiers who claimed they were there to protect you. Who would you support in that situation? The invaders or the guerrillas fighting them? Then came the air war. Operation Rolling Thunder, launched in 1965, was a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Over the years, millions of tons of bombs were dropped, more than the total tonnage used in all of World War II. Bridges, roads, factories, and even villages were targeted. The belief was that if enough destruction was unleashed, the North Vietnamese would be forced to the negotiating table. Yet, it did not break their will. Bomb craters scarred the countryside, but supply lines like the Ho Chi Minh Trail were rebuilt as quickly as they were destroyed. For every bridge taken out, the North Vietnamese built a new one. The constant bombing did not cripple their ability to fight it, hardened their resolve. And the bombing campaigns had another unintended effect. They fueled international outrage. Images of napalm strikes on villages, of children burned and fleeing down roads, spread across the world. These images undermined America's claim to be defending freedom and democracy. At home, public opinion began to turn as well. Protests grew louder, and questions about the morality and effectiveness of the war became impossible to ignore. In trying to use total war tactics to break an enemy, the United States was instead breaking its own credibility. Perhaps the most destructive part of the strategy was the use of chemical agents. Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide, was sprayed across jungles to strip away cover for the Viet Cong. Millions of acres were poisoned, forests turned barren, and farmland destroyed. But the chemical did not just affect trees and crops. It contaminated soil and water, entered the food chain, and caused long-term health effects for both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans. Children were born with severe birth defects. Farmers lost their livelihoods as their fields became unusable. What was meant as a tactical tool became a humanitarian disaster that still scars Vietnam today. To understand how badly this strategy failed, consider the mindset of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. They were fighting not just for land, but for survival and independence. Every bomb dropped, every village destroyed, was framed as proof of American aggression. Instead of breaking their will, it gave them stronger reasons to fight. Guerrilla fighters used American tactics as propaganda, telling villagers, "Look at what they do to your homes and your families. Join us and fight back." For the peasants of Vietnam, the war was not an abstract struggle of communism versus capitalism. It was personal, immediate, and brutal. And America's total war approach made that reality even clearer. The irony was staggering. America had the most advanced weapons in the world, B-5 bombers, helicopters, tanks, napalm, and chemical sprays. Yet, the enemy often carried little more than rifles, grenades, and the cover of the jungle. Instead of leveling the playing field, overwhelming firepower tilted it against America. The jungle swallowed up bombs. Villagers returned to rebuild huts. The guerrillas slipped away, reappearing in places the Americans thought they had cleared. It was like trying to kill a swarm of bees with a sledgehammer. Every swing destroyed something, but the hive only grew angrier, and the body counts that commanders proudly reported often meant little. For every enemy killed, 2 more seemed to appear. Worse, sometimes the numbers were inflated, counting civilians as combatants to make the statistics look better. This created a distorted picture of progress, convincing Washington that the war was winnable when in reality it was slipping further out of reach. The obsession with numbers blinded American leadership to the bigger picture, that wars are not won by how many bodies fall, but by breaking the will of the enemy and winning the trust of the people. The Vietnam War showed the fatal flaw in America's reliance on total war tactics. What worked against nations like Japan and Germany, industrial powers with centralized governments and armies, did not work. Against a guerrilla force spread across jungles and villages, instead of weakening the enemy, America's overwhelming force strengthened them, giving them propaganda victories and the loyalty of an embittered population. This was the tragedy of Vietnam's early years. A superpower believed it could crush a smaller nation with fire and steel. But every bomb, every torch, and every chemical spray only deepened the resistance. The lessons of World War II had been misapplied, and the cost would be measured not just in American lives, but in the countless Vietnamese civilians caught in the crossfire of a strategy doomed from the start. And this is just the beginning of the story. The tactics that America believed would guarantee victory became the very reasons they faced defeat. In the next part, we will see how the war escalated further, and how those same tactics continued to unravel under the weight of their own contradictions. If you're interested in following this story of power, strategy, and failure, make sure to like this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. This was part 1 of 5. The start of our look at how America's strongest weapons turned into its greatest weaknesses in Vietnam. The American military's reliance on total war tactics turned the Vietnam War into something far darker than a clash between armies. It became, in many ways, a war against the people of Vietnam themselves. The bombing campaigns, the torching of villages, and the search and destroy missions did not just strike at the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese army. They struck at civilians, farmers, and families who wanted nothing more than to survive. The United States entered the war claiming to protect freedom, but its methods often looked to the Vietnamese like invasion, occupation, and destruction. Search and destroy missions were one of the clearest examples of this transformation. The idea was to move into areas suspected of harboring Viet Cong fighters, sweep through, and leave nothing behind that could support the enemy. Troops would go door to door, burning homes, taking rice stores, and forcing villagers to flee. If the Viet Cong had been there, perhaps the operation denied them shelter. But if they had not, innocent civilians paid the price anyway. From the American perspective, these were tactical necessities. From the perspective of a Vietnamese farmer, it was an attack on their very life. Imagine being a villager in the Mekong Delta. One day, you tend to your rice paddies, and the next, helicopters roar overhead. Soldiers descend, and everything you own goes up in flames. Even if you had no connection to the Viet Cong, what would you feel in that moment? Gratitude to the foreigners who claimed to protect your anger and resentment at the destruction they brought to your doorstep. This was the reality that countless Vietnamese civilians lived through. Each burned village created not only physical devastation, but also a new well of hatred against the Americans. The bombing campaigns only deepened that resentment. Operations like Rolling Thunder unleashed millions of tons of explosives on North Vietnam and parts of the South. Villages were flattened, farmland was cratered, and civilians were killed in staggering numbers. The bombs did not discriminate between soldier and farmer, between a military depot and a family home. The North Vietnamese government used this destruction as propaganda, portraying the Americans not as liberators but as aggressors who rained fire on ordinary people. And the truth is, civilians did bear the brunt of much of this bombing. The scale of civilian casualties was immense. Families were torn apart, children were orphaned, and entire communities were displaced. Refugee camps swelled with those who had lost everything. For the United States, civilian casualties were often labeled as collateral damage, an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of war. But to the Vietnamese, these were not statistics. They were mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. Every death reinforced the idea that America was not there to save them, was there to dominate them. Even when not directly killing, the American approach inflicted lasting wounds on the civilian population. Agent Orange and other chemical defoliants were sprayed over vast areas, stripping jungles of their cover and destroying crops. Farmers who had relied on their land for generations suddenly faced barren fields. Water sources were poisoned, food supplies dwindled, and sickness spread. Children were born with deformities caused by exposure to the chemicals. What was meant as a tactical weapon against the Viet Cong became a slow and relentless assault on the daily lives of Vietnamese civilians. These tactics had a clear psychological effect. The Viet Cong understood that the American military, despite its firepower, was vulnerable in one key way. It needed the support, or at least the neutrality, of the local population. By contrast, the Viet Cong worked tirelessly to win that support. They promised protection, they shared supplies, and they emphasized that they were fighting for Vietnamese independence. When American troops destroyed villages, it played directly into the Viet Cong's hands. A family who might have been indifferent before now had a reason to give food, shelter, or information to the guerrillas. The war against the people was not just physical, but also emotional. The sight of American helicopters landing in villages, the fear of sudden raids, the constant sound of bombs overhead, all of these created a climate of terror. For the Americans, the goal was to wear down the enemy's will to fight. But what they often wore down instead was the patience and trust of the civilians they claimed to protect. Once that trust was broken, it could not easily be rebuilt. A single incident of brutality or destruction could undo months of attempted cooperation. One of the most infamous examples of this reality was the My Lai massacre in 1968. American troops entered a village believed to be sheltering Viet Cong fighters. Instead, what followed was the killing of hundreds of unarmed civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. While My Lai was extreme, it was not an isolated event. Smaller-scale atrocities and civilian killings happened throughout the war, many going unreported. To the Vietnamese, My Lai was not just a tragedy, it was a symbol of what the war had become, an assault on their people, carried out by a foreign army that claimed moral superiority. The resentment caused by these tactics did not just strengthen the Viet Cong, it weakened America's position globally. Footage of burned villages, wounded children, and civilian suffering spread through international media around the world. People questioned how a nation that claimed to stand for democracy could unleash such destruction on a small, rural country. At home in the United States, these images fueled protests and deepened divisions. College campuses erupted in demonstrations. Families debated the war at their dinner tables. What was framed by the government as a fight against communism increasingly looked like a war against peasants. What made this even more damaging for the Americans was the nature of guerrilla warfare. Unlike conventional armies, the Viet Cong did not need to win battles outright. They only needed to survive, to keep fighting, and to keep the population on their side. The more the Americans alienated civilians, the more the guerrillas grew in strength. A bombed-out village might lose 10 people, but it could produce 20 new recruits willing to fight against the foreign invaders. Every act of destruction planted new seeds of resistance. This cycle of violence and resentment created a war that America could not win with bombs or body counts. The more force they used, the more they turned the population against them. The war became not just about defeating an enemy army, but about trying, and failing, to win the hearts of a people whose homes were under attack. In the end, America's reliance on total war tactics was less a strategy of victory and more a path to self-defeat. The tragedy of Vietnam was that the very people America needed to win over were the ones it pushed away. Every burned village, every bomb dropped on farmland, every family forced to flee made it harder to claim legitimacy. The war against the people ensured that the guerrillas always had support, always had shelter, and always had recruits. America's mightiest weapons had been turned against it, not by superior firepower, but by the human cost they inflicted on a population that refused to be broken. This was the reality of the second stage of the Vietnam War, the moment when it became clear that overwhelming power could not secure victory if it came at the expense of the very civilians whose loyalty was essential. And it was only going to get worse as the war dragged on. The American military's actions in Vietnam created something they never intended: the perfect propaganda tool for their enemies. For the Viet Cong, every bomb that fell on a village, every burned rice field, and every civilian casualty was not just a tragedy to mourn, it was an opportunity to tell a story. That story painted the Americans not as defenders of freedom, but as destroyers of families, homes, and traditions. It was a story that spread quickly through the countryside, uniting ordinary people behind the Viet Cong's cause. The guerrilla fighters did not need to invent tales of brutality. They only had to point to the evidence left behind after each search and destroy mission: a smoldering hut, a family grieving over a lost child, a farmer staring at the ruins of his rice padazal. Of these became living testimonies of American aggression. Villagers who might have once been neutral or even suspicious of the Viet Cong now found themselves pulled toward them. The message was simple: these invaders have come to burn your homes while we are here to defend them. One of the Viet Cong's greatest strengths was their ability to embed themselves in the daily lives of rural villagers. They farmed alongside them, ate with them, and built relationships based on shared struggle. So when American bombs tore through villages, the Viet Cong could present themselves as protectors of the people. They would arrive after an airstrike, help bury the dead, provide what little supplies they had, and assure survivors that their suffering was not invented, was part of a larger fight for independence. In doing so, they converted destruction into loyalty. The brutality of the war was not confined to villages that happened to shelter guerrillas. Entire provinces suffered under heavy bombing campaigns. Operation Rolling Thunder, which was intended to break the will of North Vietnam, instead gave the North's leaders exactly what they needed: a visual and emotional weapon. Footage of devastated villages, schools reduced to rubble, and burned farmland was shown not just in Hanoi, but in homes across the South. It confirmed for many Vietnamese what the Viet Cong had been saying all along: the Americans were not here to liberate, but to conquer. The My Lai massacre became one of the most powerful examples of this propaganda effect. Hundreds of civilians, women, children, and the elderly were killed by American troops in 1968. While the U.S. government initially tried to cover it up, news of the massacre spread. For the Viet Cong, it was proof that American soldiers were not disciplined liberators, but brutal occupiers willing to kill indiscriminately. Even in areas far from My Lai, villagers heard the story and drew their own conclusions. If it could happen there, it could happen anywhere. But propaganda did not rely only on atrocities. The sheer presence of foreign soldiers moving through the countryside, speaking a different language, and bringing chaos into daily life made it easy for the Viet Cong to argue that America was the enemy of the Vietnamese people. In contrast, the Viet Cong framed themselves as sons and daughters of Vietnam, fighting for their homeland. It was a powerful narrative, and the Americans unintentionally reinforced it with every search, every bombing raid, and every refugee forced from their home. The cultural clash also added fuel to the propaganda war. American troops, often young men with little understanding of Vietnamese traditions, sometimes disrespected local customs without realizing it. A gesture, a word, or an action that seemed small to them could be deeply insulting to villagers. The Viet Cong seized on these moments, amplifying them as evidence of the Americans' disregard for Vietnamese culture. In contrast, the guerrillas emphasized their shared identity, their respect for traditions, and their vision of a free Vietnam without foreign interference. The propaganda war extended beyond Vietnam's borders as well. Images of napalm-burned children, bombed-out villages, and terrified civilians fleeing for safety began appearing in international newspapers and on television screens. For the Viet Cong, this was priceless. The more the world saw of the suffering, the easier it became to portray the United States as the villain in the conflict. Global sympathy began shifting toward the Vietnamese struggle. and this international perception further strengthened morale inside Vietnam. The American government, in contrast, struggled to control the narrative. Officials spoke about body counts, tactical victories, and communist threats. But these abstract terms meant little to a farmer whose home had just been destroyed. In villages across Vietnam, the statistics being broadcast back in Washington were meaningless compared to the empty rice bowls on dinner tables. When the Americans celebrated the destruction of a suspected Viet Cong stronghold, the Vietnamese often remembered only that it was their neighbors' homes that had burned. For the Viet Cong, this divide between American rhetoric and Vietnamese reality was the perfect opportunity. They reminded civilians that the war was not about ideology or politics in distant capitals, but about the survival of their families, farms, and traditions. Every loss reinforced the idea that fighting alongside the guerrillas was not only just, but necessary. When a child died in a bombing raid, the grief was real. But the Viet Cong turned that grief into motivation, telling villagers that the only way to honor the dead was to resist the invaders. Even in places where the Viet Cong had little physical presence, the power of their narrative grew. Stories of American brutality traveled from village to village, passed along by word of mouth. A single destroyed hamlet could ripple outward, poisoning the reputation of American forces across an entire region. And because guerrilla warfare depends on blending into the population, the Americans could never fully erase these stories. Any villager might carry a memory of destruction, and any one of those memories could fuel the resistance. The longer the war dragged on, the more effective this propaganda became. By the late 1960s, the Viet Cong no longer had to work as hard to convince people of American brutality. Villagers had seen it for themselves. The guerrillas could simply point to the scars on the land, the craters in the fields, and the families living as refugees. America's overwhelming firepower was supposed to break the will of the enemy, but instead, it became the very reason the enemy's will hardened. The irony was that the Viet Cong often lacked resources, weapons, and supplies. They could not outgun the Americans on the battlefield. But with every bomb dropped and every civilian casualty, the Americans provided the Viet Cong with something even more powerful than weapons: legitimacy. The guerrillas did not have to invent the cruelty of their enemy, was demonstrated daily. And in a war fought as much in hearts and minds as on the battlefield, legitimacy was everything. This was how the American strategy, rooted in overwhelming force, became its own undoing. By turning the countryside into a battlefield, they gave the Viet Cong the chance to turn themselves into defenders of the people. By trying to terrify their enemy into submission, they instead unified a nation against them. For the Viet Cong, it was not just a war, it was a narrative, and every American misstep added another chapter. The story of Vietnam at this stage was not simply one of bombs and bullets, but of perception. The brutality of American tactics, whether intended or not, was transformed into a rallying cry. For the Viet Cong, propaganda was not an accessory to the war, it was the war. And in that battle for perception, the Americans were losing ground every day. The American military strategic failure in Vietnam was not only about tactics or weapons, it was about people. Wars are not won by bombs alone. They are won by convincing the population that you are the better alternative, that life under your protection will be safer and more prosperous than life under your enemy. In Vietnam, the United States never managed to achieve this. Instead, their actions convinced millions of Vietnamese that they were not liberators, but just another foreign occupier. No different from the French, who had been driven out only a decade earlier. The phrase, winning hearts and minds, was not just a slogan. It was supposed to be the central strategy of counterinsurgency. The idea was simple in theory. If the United States could show the Vietnamese people that they cared about their well-being, then the population would stop supporting the Viet Cong. Villages would turn against the guerrillas, provide intelligence, and help isolate the insurgents. But this never happened. Instead, the opposite unfolded. For centuries, the Vietnamese had resisted foreign domination. They had fought Chinese dynasties, Mongol invasions, and later, European colonial powers. Their identity as a people was tied to resistance. When the Americans arrived, promising democracy and freedom, but bringing napalm and destruction, many Vietnamese saw little difference between them and the French colonialists they had just expelled. The memory of occupation was fresh, and the sight of another foreign army marching through their villages triggered a deep sense of distrust. Every action the U.S. military took that harmed civilians reinforced this perception. A search and destroy mission that burned down a hamlet might kill a few guerrillas, but it displaced dozens of families. Those families, homeless and bitter, often had nowhere to turn but the Viet Cong. Instead of reducing enemy support, American operations created new recruits. In the eyes of a farmer who had lost his land, the Viet Cong were not terrorists. They were the only force fighting to protect Vietnam's independence. One of the biggest flaws in the American approach was the heavy reliance on firepower. Airstrikes and artillery were used constantly to eliminate suspected Viet Cong positions. But to the villagers who lived under these bombardments, it felt like collective punishment. A rice field destroyed by a bombing raid was not just a piece of land, it was a family's livelihood. Once destroyed, that family faced hunger. The Viet Cong understood this dynamic and capitalized on it. They would step in with whatever little resources they had, framing themselves as defenders of the people against foreign aggression. The American government tried to counter this by launching programs meant to improve village life, building schools, digging wells, and providing medicine. But these programs were often undermined by the very military tactics used alongside them. A school built one week might be destroyed by an airstrike the next. A well dug in one village meant little if the village next door had just been burned down. The inconsistency made it impossible for the U.S. to build trust. The message became muddled. How could the same army that destroyed your home also claim to be there to help you? Another major issue was cultural misunderstanding. Many American soldiers arrived in Vietnam with little knowledge of the language, history, or customs of the people they were supposed to protect. Simple acts like entering homes without removing boots or failing to respect local traditions could cause offense. These might have seemed minor to the soldiers, but to villagers, they were further proof of foreign arrogance. The Viet Cong, by contrast, shared the same cultural background and could present themselves as part of the community. Even in urban areas where the South Vietnamese government had more control, the perception of America as an occupier was strong. Corruption within the South Vietnamese leadership, which was propped up by American support, further alienated the population. Many Vietnamese saw their own government as weak and illegitimate, surviving only because of U.S. money and soldiers. This made it easier for the Viet Cong to argue that they were the true representatives of the Vietnamese people. The Tet Offensive of 1968 drove this point home. Although it was a military disaster for the Viet Cong, the mere fact that they were able to launch coordinated attacks across South Vietnam shocked both the American public and the Vietnamese population. For many civilians, it was proof that the Viet Cong were strong and that the American-backed government was vulnerable. It exposed the limits of American power and further weakened efforts to win local support. The psychological aspect of the war cannot be ignored. Vietnamese villagers lived in constant fear, not just of the Viet Cong, but of American soldiers as well. Night raids, forced relocations, and the destruction of property made daily life unpredictable. In such an environment, loyalty naturally gravitated toward the side that seemed most committed to Vietnam's independence, and that was never the Americans. America's inability to win hearts and minds also extended beyond Vietnam itself. Internationally, images of napalm-burned children and destroyed villages turned public opinion against the war. Protests erupted, not just in the United States, but across the world. For the Vietnamese, seeing this global sympathy only reinforced the idea that they were fighting a just cause against an unjust invader. Perhaps the clearest example of this failure was the creation of strategic hamlets. The idea was to relocate rural villagers into fortified communities where they would be safe from Viet Cong influence. On paper, it seemed like a way to cut off support for the insurgents. In reality, it often meant tearing families from their ancestral lands, forcing them into artificial villages with poor living conditions. Instead of isolating the Viet Cong, it gave them yet another talking point. The Americans were uprooting traditional Vietnamese life in the name of control. All of this added up to a war that could never be won through firepower alone. The more the U.S. relied on bombing, the more they alienated the very people they needed to win over. The more they tried to impose control, the more they appeared as occupiers. The war became less about defeating an enemy army and more about convincing a population. And in that battle, the United States failed spectacularly. The tragedy was that many American leaders understood, at least in theory, that winning hearts and minds was the key to victory. But in practice, their actions undermined their own goals. A military built for conventional warfare, designed to fight large armies on open battlefields, could not adapt to the demands of a counterinsurgency. In Vietnam, this mismatch between theory and practice cost them dearly. For the Vietnamese, the fight was not just about politics or ideology. It was about independence, identity, and survival. And in a struggle like that, the side that could convince the people of their legitimacy would always have the upper hand. The Americans, with all their weapons and wealth, never understood this fundamental truth. And because of that, they were destined to lose. The Vietnam War ended not with a clear American victory, but with helicopters evacuating desperate people from rooftops in Saigon. The image of U.S. personnel scrambling to leave as the North Vietnamese army closed in has become one of the most enduring symbols of American defeat. For a superpower that saw itself as unstoppable, this was not just a military loss, it was a humiliation that scarred the nation's identity for decades. The American military had gone into Vietnam believing that its unmatched firepower could force any opponent into submission. After all, this was the country that had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, two of the most powerful war machines in history. But Vietnam exposed the limits of American military power. The United States had prepared for a conventional war with tanks, aircraft carriers, and strategic bombing campaigns. What they faced instead was a guerrilla army that melted into the jungles, fought on its own terms, and refused to give up, no matter how much destruction was unleashed upon them. The cost of this miscalculation was staggering. More than 58,000 American soldiers lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands more returned home physically wounded or psychologically scarred. For the Vietnamese, the numbers were even worse. Millions of civilians and soldiers died, entire villages were wiped off the map, and large swaths of the countryside were poisoned by chemical defoliants, like Agent Orange. The war left behind a devastated landscape and a generation marked by trauma. Yet, despite the enormous destruction, the United States could not claim victory. The political victory belonged to the Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies. They had not only survived against the most powerful military in the world, but had forced it to withdraw. This was more than just a battlefield triumph, which was a blow to American prestige on the global stage. Allies who once saw the United States as an unbeatable guardian began to question its reliability. Enemies saw proof that the giant could be challenged and even defeated. What made the defeat so humiliating was not just the loss itself, but the way it unfolded. For years, American officials had promised that victory was just around the corner. Reports claimed that the Viet Cong were weakening, that the bombing campaigns were working, and that the end was in sight. But each time, the reality on the ground told a different story. The Tet Offensive in 1968 shattered the illusion of progress. Though it was technically a military setback for the Viet Cong, the fact that they could strike across South Vietnam in such a coordinated way proved that American claims of near victory were hollow. Public trust in the government eroded, and support for the war collapsed at home. This collapse of support was crucial. Unlike in World War II, where the American public was united behind the war effort, Vietnam created deep divisions. Protests erupted across college campuses. Families were torn apart by disagreements over whether the war was just. Images of body bags returning home, combined with shocking news coverage of civilian massacres like My Lai, shifted public opinion. Eventually, the government could no longer ignore the growing demand to bring the troops home. The war had not only been lost on the battlefield, but also in the living rooms of America, where nightly television broadcasts showed the brutality of the conflict in unfiltered detail. The legacy of failure hung heavily over the military itself. Soldiers returned to a country that was often hostile or indifferent to their sacrifice. Unlike veterans of earlier wars, many Vietnam veterans did not receive parades or recognition. Instead, they were met with protests and anger, as if they were to blame for the decisions made by political leaders. The psychological toll of fighting a war that many came to see as pointless was immense. For those who served, the humiliation of withdrawal was personal as well as national. Strategically, Vietnam forced the American military to confront an uncomfortable truth. Advanced technology, massive budgets, and overwhelming firepower could not guarantee success in every conflict. The United States had been defeated not by a superpower, but by a poorer nation that relied on determination, strategy, and popular support. This realization reshaped military thinking for decades to come. influencing how the U.S. approached future conflicts in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Yet even in those later wars, the shadow of Vietnam loomed large, a reminder of what happens when hearts and minds are lost before the battle is won. For the Vietnamese, the war proved the power of persistence. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army endured unimaginable losses. Yet their willingness to keep fighting eventually broke the will of their much stronger enemy. This was not just a military struggle, but a political one. And in political wars, survival itself can be victory. By refusing to surrender, they ensured that the United States would eventually tire of the fight and withdraw. The final scenes in Saigon in 1975 drove this point home. As North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the city, the South Vietnamese government crumbled almost overnight. The United States, after pouring billions of dollars and years of effort into propping it up, could not prevent its collapse. The evacuation of the U.S. Embassy, with helicopters lifting people off rooftops, became the defining image of the war's end. It was not the triumphant return of soldiers marching home in victory, it was chaos, desperation, and defeat. The humiliation of Vietnam was not only a military matter, but also a cultural one. It shattered the myth of American invincibility. For much of the 20th century, the United States had been seen as a nation that could not lose a war. Vietnam proved otherwise. It showed that even the strongest armies could be beaten if they failed to understand the nature of the conflict they were fighting. And it showed that wars fought without the support of the people both at home and abroad are wars that cannot be won. The lessons of Vietnam remain powerful, not just for historians, but for anyone who tries to understand how nations wage war. It is a story of arrogance, miscalculation, and tragedy. It is also a reminder that the will of a determined people can overcome even the most powerful armies in the world. And that's the end of this 5-part breakdown on America's failure in Vietnam. If you enjoyed this series, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more deep dives into history's biggest mistakes, strange moments, and forgotten stories.